Montana Territory, 1873. The mountains stood like jagged teeth against the autumn sky as Sadie Kincaid tucked a wayward strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. At 22, she had already lived several lifetimes of hardship, each one teaching her the same bitter lesson. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not out here where the wilderness swallowed people whole, leaving nothing but whispered stories around campfires. Sadie adjusted the simple blue cotton dress she'd mended 3 times over, her fingers tracing the worn fabric as she surveyed the small plot of land she'd inherited when her uncle passed. 160 acres of Montana promise that felt more like a prison sentence than freedom. 2 years of working this homestead alone had taught her that survival required isolation. Connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death in a land where winter storms and desperate men showed equal mercy. The late afternoon sun caught the silver locket around her neck, the only remnant of her mother, dead 8 years now. Inside lay a faded portrait and a pressed wildflower, mementos of a time when Sadie still believed in permanence. Before the fever took her parents, before the wagon train massacre claimed her older sister, before her uncle's heart gave out, leaving her truly alone. "Just you and me now," she whispered to the small cabin she'd maintained through sheer determination. A woman alone had to be twice as strong, twice as clever, and twice as suspicious as any man. The frontier wasn't a place for softness. It was a place for survival. And surviving meant keeping everyone at a distance. Sadie had convinced herself that loneliness was preferable to loss, that independence meant safety, that the ache in her chest when she crawled into an empty bed each night was a small price to pay for control over her fate. She wanted nothing more than to keep her small homestead productive enough to survive, to prove to herself and the doubters in nearby Silverdale that a woman alone could make it. What she couldn't admit, even to herself in the darkest hours of night, was how desperately she longed for someone to share the burden, for a hand to hold when the blizzards howled, for a voice to break the silence that sometimes grew so loud she could barely think. As she hefted a bucket of water from the well, Sadie caught sight of a rider approaching from the east. Her hand instinctively moved to the shotgun propped against the cabin wall. Visitors rarely brought good news. The stranger rode tall in the saddle, his bay horse moving with purpose across the golden grass. As he drew closer, Sadie noted his youth, perhaps 25, and the lack of threat in his posture. Still, she kept the shotgun within reach as she stepped into the yard. "That's far enough," she called when he was within earshot. "State your business." The young man reined his horse to a stop, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. The late afternoon light caught his features, a strong jawline softened by a gentle smile, clear blue eyes, and sandy brown hair that curled slightly beneath his hat. Unlike many men who traveled these parts, he was clean-shaven save for the lightest stubble, suggesting recent care despite trail dust. "Name's Kyle Forrester, ma'am," he called back, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. "Riding for the Double Circle outfit. Our cattle broke through a fence line about 2 miles back. Thought you might have seen strays passing through." Sadie's grip on the shotgun loosened slightly, but her wariness remained. Cattle drives meant cowboys, and cowboys meant trouble more often than not. "Haven't seen any cattle," she replied. "But you're welcome to check the north pasture. Just keep clear of my garden." Kyle nodded, sweeping his hat from his head in a gesture of respect that caught Sadie off guard. Most men treated a woman alone with either predatory interest or dismissive scorn. This stranger's simple courtesy felt unfamiliar. "Appreciate that kindness, miss." "Kincaid. Sadie Kincaid." As Kyle dismounted to lead his horse, Sadie noticed he favored his right leg slightly. A thin line of blood had soaked through his denims just below the knee. "You're bleeding," she stated flatly. Kyle glanced down with mild surprise. "Branch caught me while I was riding through the timber. Nothing serious." "Infection's serious enough out here," Sadie replied, making a split-second decision that defied her own rules. "There's clean water by the pump. I've got bandages inside." The moment she offered help, Sadie questioned her judgment. Opening her door to a stranger violated everything experience had taught her about survival. But something in his straightforward manner suggested Kyle Forrester wasn't the type to repay kindness with cruelty. As she retrieved bandages and a small jar of salve, Sadie reminded herself that this was a practical matter, not a breach in her defenses. An injured cowboy would have trouble rounding up strays, and the sooner he found his cattle, the sooner he'd be gone. Outside, Kyle had rolled up his pant leg to reveal a 4-inch gash. He was washing it carefully with water from the pump when Sadie returned. "That needs stitching," she observed, setting down her supplies. Kyle looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "You know how to stitch wounds." "Had to learn." She nodded toward the cabin. "Come inside where there's better light." As she threaded a needle with steady hands, Sadie found herself oddly aware of the stranger's presence in her small home. It had been nearly 8 months since anyone had crossed her threshold. The cabin suddenly felt smaller with his tall frame occupying space at her table. "What brings a Texas man to Montana?" she asked, partly to distract him as she began the first stitch, partly because curiosity had gotten the better of her. Kyle winced, but held perfectly still. Wanted to see country that wasn't flat as a griddle. Double Circle's owner needed men who could handle rough terrain. "And can you handle rough terrain?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Better than I handled that low branch, apparently." Despite herself, Sadie felt an answering smile threaten. She suppressed it, focusing on her work. "You running this place alone?" Kyle asked, glancing around at the modest but well-kept cabin. "Yes." Her tone made it clear she needed no pity. "That's impressive. Most men I know couldn't manage half as well." The simple acknowledgement, delivered without condescension, caught Sadie off guard. She tied off the last stitch and straightened. "It's nothing impressive about it. It's survival." Kyle studied her face for a moment. Sometimes those are the same thing. Something about his words, or perhaps the thoughtful way he said them, lingered with Sadie long after she'd bandaged his leg and sent him on his way with directions to where his strays might have wandered. That night, as she bolted her door against the gathering darkness, Sadie told herself the peculiar emptiness she felt was merely the disruption of routine. Nothing more. 3 days later, she was repairing a gap in her chicken coop when hoofbeats announced a visitor. Kyle Forrester rode into her yard, leading a second horse that carried something bulky wrapped in canvas. "Miss Kincaid," he greeted, touching the brim of his hat. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Depends on why you're here," she replied, setting down her hammer. Kyle dismounted with noticeably more ease than before. "Brought you something. Call it payment for your doctoring." He unwrapped the canvas to reveal a quarter of beef, freshly butchered and wrapped for preservation. "The outfit slaughtered a steer yesterday. Thought you might make use of this." Sadie stared at the offering, its value unmistakable with winter approaching. She'd been planning to trade 3 of her quilts in town for meat, but this would save her that expense. "That's too generous for a few stitches," she said cautiously. "Not from where I'm standing. That leg could have gone bad without proper care." He hesitated. "Besides, I noticed your smokehouse is nearly empty." The observation reminded Sadie how vulnerable her solitary existence made her to outside assessment. Yet instead of feeling threatened by his attention to detail, she found herself oddly touched by the thoughtfulness behind it. "Thank you," she said finally. "I'll take it as fair trade, then." Together they carried the meat to her smokehouse, where Kyle helped her hang it properly. As they worked, he mentioned casually that the cattle drive would be camped nearby for another week before heading to the railhead in Helena. "The boss sent some of us to scout the terrain ahead," he explained. "Make sure we won't lose any more to broken legs in the rough country." Sadie nodded, trying to ignore the strange flutter in her chest at the news he wouldn't be riding out immediately. It meant nothing to her either way, she told herself firmly. As Kyle prepared to leave, he paused by his horse. "The outfit's cook makes decent coffee, but I've been thinking about your apple pie for days. Any chance you might be willing to trade another one for some help around your place?" The request was so unexpected that Sadie laughed before she could stop herself. The sound was rusty from disuse, but genuine. "What makes you think I bake apple pies?" Kyle's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Smelled it when I was in your cabin. Been dreaming about it since." The simple admission, delivered with such earnestness, cracked something in Sadie's carefully maintained facade. For the first time in years, she found herself agreeing to a purely social arrangement. "Come back tomorrow afternoon. There might be pie." That night, as she peeled apples by lamplight, Sadie told herself this was merely practical economics, trading food for labor. Nothing more than frontier bartering. But as she carefully latticed the crust the way her mother had taught her, she couldn't deny the anticipation humming beneath her skin. Kyle arrived the next day leading a workhorse loaded with tools. Without presumption, he asked where she needed the most help, then set to work repairing her sagging barn roof, a task that had been beyond her reach for months. By sundown, he had accomplished more than Sadie could have managed in a week. When she called him in for supper, the ease of their conversation surprised her. Kyle spoke of growing up on a small Texas ranch, of losing his father in the war, of working cattle drives to help support his mother and younger siblings. There was no bravado in his stories, just the matter-of-fact recounting of a young man who had shouldered responsibility early. "Your family must miss you," Sadie observed as she served the promised pie. Kyle nodded, a flash of homesickness crossing his features. "They do. But the money I send back means my sisters can stay in school instead of going into service. My brother's apprenticed to a blacksmith now. That's admirable. It's family," he said simply, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did, Sadie thought. Family had once been the center of her world too, before death had stripped it away piece by piece. As twilight deepened into night, Kyle rose to leave. "Thank you for the meal. Best I've had in months." "Thank you for the roof," Sadie replied. "It's been letting in rain since spring." At the door, Kyle hesitated. "I've got 2 more days before I need to rejoin the main drive. Could use the work if you've got more that needs doing." Sadie knew she should refuse. Allowing Kyle Forrester further into her life, even as a hired hand, meant opening a door she'd kept firmly closed. And yet, "The north fence needs mending," she heard herself say. "And there's a section of creek bank washing out near the lower field." His smile was worth the risk of trusting, if only for a few days. True to his word, Kyle returned each morning, working from sunup to sundown on the endless tasks a homestead generated. They fell into an unexpected rhythm, working separately but in tandem, sharing meals, exchanging stories as darkness fell. By the 3rd day, Sadie realized with alarm how quickly she'd grown accustomed to his presence. On the afternoon before Kyle was to rejoin the cattle drive, a fierce storm blew in from the mountains. They barely made it to the barn with the horses before the sky opened. Thunder shook the timbers as they stood in the doorway, watching sheets of rain transform the yard into a quagmire. "You won't make it back to your camp in this," Sadie said, raising her voice above the downpour. Kyle nodded, his expression troubled. "I don't want to impose. There's the lean-to off the kitchen. It's dry at least." As they dashed through the rain to the cabin, Sadie felt a wild exhilaration that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with the man beside her. For the first time in years, she wasn't facing the elements alone. Inside, they shed their soaked outer clothes. Sadie busied herself building up the fire while Kyle arranged his bedroll in the small lean-to. The storm's intensity made conversation difficult, so they worked in companionable silence preparing a simple supper. As they ate by lamplight, the cabin cozy against the howling wind, Kyle spoke of his plans to save enough for his own ranch someday. "Not in Texas, though," he said. "I've taken a liking to this country, despite its temperamental nature." He glanced toward the window where rain lashed against the glass. "It's beautiful when it's not trying to kill you," Sadie agreed, surprised by the fondness in her own voice. When had Montana's harshness become beautiful to her? Like most worthwhile things, Kyle observed, his eyes meeting hers across the table. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Sadie felt her carefully constructed walls trembling, not collapsing, but revealing previously unnoticed windows. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having swept east during the night. They stood in the yard, the moment of parting awkward with unspoken thoughts. "I'll be back this way in about 6 weeks," Kyle said finally, "after we deliver the herd and get paid. Would it be all right if I stopped by? There's that root cellar you mentioned wanting to expand before winter sets in." Sadie knew she should make a clean break. Every instinct honed by years of self-preservation warned against the hope kindling in her chest. And yet, 6 weeks, she agreed. The root cellar could use an extra pair of hands. As she watched him ride away, Sadie struggled to name the feeling expanding beneath her ribs. It wasn't just the prospect of help with her endless work. It was the realization that for the first time in years, she was looking forward to something beyond mere survival. 5 weeks and 3 days later, not that Sadie was counting, riders appeared on the eastern ridge. Instead of the solitary figure she'd been watching for, however, There were 4 men, none of them Kyle. Something cold settled in her stomach as she reached for her shotgun. The men reined in at a respectful distance. Their leader, a weather-beaten man in his 50s, removed his hat. "Miss Kincaid, I'm Jeremiah Walsh, trail boss for the Double Circle." Sadie's hands tightened on her weapon. "What brings you to my property, Mr. Walsh?" "It's about Kyle Forrester, ma'am." The man's expression was grave. "There was trouble at the railhead in Helena." The world tilted sideways as Walsh explained how Kyle had intervened when a drunk cowhand had drawn on an unarmed storekeeper. In the ensuing struggle, Kyle had been shot. The wound had festered during the journey back. "He's asking for you," Walsh finished. "We've got him at Doc Simmons' place in Silverdale. Doc's done what he can, but—" He left the sentence unfinished. Sadie was already moving, throwing essentials into a saddlebag, her mind racing ahead to what would be needed. Within 10 minutes, she had locked the cabin and mounted her horse. The ride to Silverdale passed in a blur of dust and dread. By the time they reached the doctor's small house at the edge of town, Sadie's heart was pounding with fear she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge during the journey. Dr. Simmons, a kindly man in his 60s, met her at the door. "You must be Miss Kincaid. He's been calling your name." The sick room was dim and close, smelling of carbolic and fever. Kyle lay motionless on a narrow bed, his face flushed, his breathing labored. Sadie approached slowly, shocked by how diminished he appeared compared to the vital young man who had repaired her roof. "Kyle," she said softly, taking his hand. It burned against her skin. His eyes flickered open, clouded with pain but brightening when he recognized her. "Sadie, you came." "Of course I came," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Someone has to finish that root cellar." A ghost of his smile touched his lips before his eyes slid closed again. Dr. Simmons drew her aside. "The bullet's out, but infection's set in. I've done everything I know to do." "Then I'll do what you don't know to do," Sadie replied with quiet determination. "My mother was a healer back east. I need yarrow, willow bark, and echinacea if you can find it." For 3 days and nights, Sadie barely left Kyle's side. She bathed his burning skin with cool cloths, spooned broth and herbal teas between his cracked lips, and changed the poultices on his wound. She spoke to him constantly, reminding him of work waiting at her homestead, describing the apple trees that would need harvesting, recounting memories she'd never shared with anyone. On the 4th night, when Kyle's fever broke, leaving him weak but lucid, Sadie finally allowed herself to cry. Silent tears that fell onto their clasped hands as she sat beside his bed. "Don't waste those on me," Kyle murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. "I'm too stubborn to die." Sadie looked up, hastily wiping her cheeks. "I wasn't crying," she lied. "It's just dusty in here." His weak chuckle turned into a grimace of pain, but his eyes remained clear as they held hers. "You saved my life." "You saved that storekeeper's life," she countered. "Seems we're even." Kyle's hand tightened around hers. "I need to tell you something, in case things had gone differently." He took a labored breath. "Meeting you changed everything for me. I've been riding from place to place for years, never feeling like I belonged anywhere. But that week at your homestead, I felt like I'd found something I didn't even know I was looking for." The raw honesty in his voice pierced through the last of Sadie's defenses. The fear that had gripped her heart since learning of his injuries suddenly revealed itself as something else entirely, something she had refused to name because naming it meant acknowledging her vulnerability. "I've been alone so long," she whispered, the confession painful in its truth. "I convinced myself it was safer that way, that needing someone was a weakness I couldn't afford. And now," Kyle asked, his eyes never leaving hers, "now I'm sitting in a sick room in Silverdale instead of tending my homestead, because the thought of you dying before I could tell you." She faltered. "Tell me what, Sadie?" "That you make me want to risk being weak again." The words hung between them, fragile and immense. Kyle lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss against her fingers. "There's nothing weak about courage," he said. "And trusting someone takes more courage than facing down any gunman." Recovery was slow. By the time Kyle could stand without assistance, autumn had painted the countryside in russet and gold. Dr. Simmons declared him well enough to travel, though cautioned against hard labor for at least another month. "What will you do now?" Sadie asked as they sat on the doctor's porch, watching a golden sunset paint the distant mountains. Kyle turned to face her, his expression serious. That depends entirely on you. On me. I've been doing some thinking while I've been laid up. Life's shorter than we like to believe. Too short to waste it wandering when you've found where you belong. He took a deep breath. I belong with you, Sadie. If you'll have me. The directness of his declaration stole Sadie's breath. You hardly know me, she protested weakly. I know you're strong enough to survive alone, but brave enough to choose not to be. I know you're fiercely independent, but gentle when tending the wounded. I know your apple pie is worth riding 100 miles for. His smile softened. And I know I love you. The rest we can learn together. Sadie's heart hammered against her ribs. The prospect of opening herself completely to another person terrified her. But the alternative, returning to her solitary existence knowing what she'd be missing, terrified her more. My homestead needs more work than one man can handle, she said carefully. Even when you're fully recovered. Then we'll hire help when we need it. Or we'll do what we can and let the rest wait. The winters are brutal. You might regret leaving Texas. Kyle's eyes crinkled. I won't be cold with you beside me. Sadie took a shaky breath. Are you asking to court me, Kyle Forrester? I'm asking to marry you, he replied simply. I'm offering my name, my heart, and every day I have left on this earth. The tears that had threatened spilled over as Sadie realized she was being offered exactly what she'd stopped allowing herself to want. A partner, a future, a family. A home that wasn't just a place, but a belonging. Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. 2 weeks later, they stood before the traveling minister who had stopped in Silverdale on his circuit. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by Dr. Simmons and a few townspeople who had come to know them during Kyle's recovery. Sadie wore her mother's dress, carefully altered to fit her slimmer frame, with wildflowers in her chestnut hair. Kyle stood straight and proud, his strength returning daily, his eyes never leaving her face as they spoke their vows. I promise to build a life with you, he said when it came time for personal pledges. To face whatever comes, good harvests and bad, summer heat and winter storms, together. To make sure you never have to stand alone against the world again. Sadie's voice trembled as she responded. I promise to trust you with my heart, my fears, my dreams. To remember that sharing burdens doesn't make me weaker, but makes us both stronger. To build a home with you that shelters more than just our bodies, but our souls. As they rode back to her homestead, their homestead now, the land seemed to welcome them with golden light cascading across the rolling hills. The cabin that had once felt like a fortress against a hostile world now beckoned as a haven they would share. That night, as they lay tangled together in what had been her solitary bed, Sadie marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just a few months. The fear that had defined her existence for so long hadn't disappeared entirely. Perhaps it never would, but it had been balanced by something stronger. The certainty that whatever came, she would no longer face it alone. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings. Kyle had spent the winter expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen with windows that caught the morning light. They'd weathered blizzards and food shortages, minor arguments and major decisions about crops and livestock. Through it all, the bond between them had deepened, rooted in respect and tempered by shared hardship. As they stood together on the porch surveying the fields they'd planted together, Kyle's arm around her waist, Sadie felt a contentment she'd once thought impossible on the harsh frontier. Do you ever regret it? She asked, leaning into his embrace. Giving up the freedom of the trail for this? Kyle looked down at her, the love in his eyes as clear as the spring sky above them. This is freedom, he replied. Being exactly where I'm meant to be, with exactly who I'm meant to be with. Sadie laid her hand over his where it rested on her stomach, now just beginning to round with the child they would welcome in autumn. We're going to need a bigger cabin soon, she said, smiling up at him. Kyle's face lit with joy as he understood her meaning. He gathered her close, his kiss a promise of all the years stretching before them. Then we'll build it, he said, together. As the sun climbed higher over the Montana hills, casting its golden light on the home they'd created, Sadie knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found what she'd stopped believing existed. Not just shelter from the wilderness, but a place where her heart could finally rest. After years of standing alone against the frontier's harshness, she had discovered that true strength wasn't found in isolation, but in the courage to join her life with another's. In Kyle's love, in the family they were creating, in the land they worked side by side, Sadie Kincaid Forrester had finally, irrevocably, come home.